Hello and welcome to the MIT Open Documentary Lab Talk. We're back for the semester and so glad to be back. And today I'm so pleased to introduce Thenmozhi Soundararajan. She's a Dalit right activist, filmmaker, transmedia artist, technologist, theorist, and someone who's really been at the forefront of exposing and fighting against caste discrimination, not only abroad, but in this country, as well as racial and gender discrimination in really courageous and creative ways. Today, she's going to talk to us about her socially engaged art in these difficult times and what it means to be an artist and how you can produce as an artist in these trying times and practice self-care. Before I pass it to her, I just want to remind people that if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A. And if you want to vote the ones you want to hear up to the top, feel free to do that. And we'll take a few questions at the end of her talk. So without further ado, Thenmozhi Soundararajan.
Wonderful, Jay Beam, and hello everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all, and I'm looking forward to us getting into this conversation. And want to thank again, all the folks at MIT and Sarah for hosting this conversation today, because it's not often that we get to be able to talk about the ways that we can look at visionary practices of making art in very volatile times. And so I'm hoping that this will be like an intimate way for us to kind of get into it. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and get into my document, and we can get started. Again, I think for me, part of the reason why I wanted to start off with this conversation is that I know a lot of people who have really been wanting to approach the volatility of this moment, whether we're talking about the pandemic or the climate crisis or the rise of authoritarianism or racial injustice, through the lens of arts practice. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think with arts practice, we're able to provide, a lens that goes beyond rapid response to issues, so that we can provoke, more rigorous examination of root causes, or I think sometimes even to heal, right? Because one of the things that's so compelling about this moment is that, as much violence as we've all collectively faced, beauty often heals. And so to be able to think about ways we can create resonance through both the process and the product of the things that we create at this time, I believe that, artists have such a critical role at the table of change at this moment, because in some ways, the dreaming that we do is what connects the policies to the people who are going to build what comes next, because we provide that heart connection. And so, for those of you that are new in your practice, or for those of you that are kind of senior practitioners, I'm hoping that this can open up a conversation that bridges all of our places we might be in terms of engaging on this issue, to thinking about ways you can create communities of support, communities of healing, and communities that can build a future that can nourish us at a time when we need it the most. So, and for me, a big part of, my arts practice has really been kind of, looking at the ways that I deal with the issues of violence as someone who is a caste oppressed person. And, again, for people who aren't familiar with the system of caste, this is as brutal a system as the system of race. It's older than the system of race. It goes back to, 2000 BC, but it is a dominator culture that basically rips everything from you when you are caste oppressed. It determines the whole of your life, your spiritual purity, and, predisposes you to structural violence, And so for me, as someone who's a Dalit artist, I would often, really look at this question through the lens of dreaming, and that, some of the hardest things to do for my people was to dream a future when we were sentenced to an apartheid. And that to really think about that practice really meant about what it meant to be a dreamer at the end of a world. And in that way, like what I do as a Dalit artist, I can imagine many people finding resonance in, because we are finding ourselves at the end of many political moments right now. I remember when Trump first got elected, many people were like, does this mean the end of the nation state? Certainly with COVID-19, I think many people are struggling with, how do we rebuild what comes next? And do you want to simply replace what occurred before when so much was wrong? Right. So again, I think that this question about what it means to be a dreamer at the end of the world is about inviting artists to basically take open as broad and as open a canvas to the ways that we apply our arts practice to solutions that may be given, particular boundaries within policies, but that we can actually use the imaginary as like a very fertile place to begin experimentation, because the imagination is for free, right? And in many ways, I think that, this is why I really think about my work as socially engaged practice of speculative making, because, in many ways, speculative making basically encompasses not only the product of what I'm looking at, but also ways that the process itself is also transformative. And I think for people who are beginning to be socially engaged artists, the idea that both the process and the product can be ways that you find impact in the work that you're doing is very critical as you're starting to develop your artist statements, or the, mapping the change that you want to do with your work. Because oftentimes, particularly in a fine arts practice, everything gets very focused on the product itself. But we have great openings in process. And in fact, in many cases, the transformation of relationships happens in the process part of this kind of an arts practice. And so I want to really encourage people to think about that. And, for me, I think that, another way that I imagine this core question is, can we imagine ourselves beyond oppression? And as someone who is an artist that comes from an oppressed background, this is a very, very difficult question, because oftentimes, like if you're dealing with race, or if you're dealing with caste or sexual orientation or gender presentation, or immigration status, oftentimes like you're always dealing with the issues that are front loaded for your community in terms of rapid response. And, I find that like so painful sometimes, because it feels like our peoples might just be beginning to like dig up the bones, and doing the forensics of the violence that has happened. And while we're doing that, our oppressors are stealing the stars. And I always feel like we should have had a right to the stars right from the beginning. And that's why I feel like, within speculative making and socially engaged artistry, it's important to always have some part of our focus be centered on the visionary, centered on something that goes beyond just the examination of the problem, because these limitations are all distractions from our humanity. And I think if we can't reward ourselves in our arts practice with humanity, where else can we do that? And in many ways, like what we're talking about is freedom. And this is one of the biggest processes for me that I really deeply engaged in. For me, is that every part of my art and what I engaged in terms of my arts practice is about freeing myself, freeing my people, freeing the people that are part of my audience, and really thinking about ways that we are looking at liberatory processes throughout all of it. And I started this process really thinking about the fact that I saw that for many people, they could not begin to fight for freedom if they could not imagine themselves to be free. And this is such a really poignant point, is that I think for many oppressed peoples and the conversations that shape our issues, people already create within a box, and that could be a box told to you by society, by systems of oppression. Maybe it's the box of policy around a particular issue, but that box becomes like a cage, where a bird that has learned to fly in a cage only thinks its wingspan is so little. It doesn't know that the sky is its territory. And I think that's actually part of where the moving of socially engaged art is really important, is that you can basically move the goalpost of what's possible. You can push people in the realm of the imaginary to open up and think about things that may feel incredibly impossible in this present moment, but can become possible the more people start to invest in the emotional energy and intention of the imaginary to make it material. And I always feel like for myself, like one of the biggest artifacts of this example is myself, because, my caste, again, was founded in the 13th century. We were called the Buddhian caste. And the deep thing about that caste was that it was so seen as so foul, the way that our people were treated, that the English developed the word pariah based on how they saw us being subjugated. And at that time, I can imagine that, like my foremothers and forefathers, they would not have ever experienced freedom, not freedom like you and I would know it. But I think that in their hearts, they nursed a hope that one day one of their descendants would be a daughter of freedom. And for them, to think about that, to nurse that, to have hope be a micro expression in their mind, and allow that possibility to grow until both me and my sister were born. That's an amazing testament to the process of the imaginary yielding to the material. And that's like my own personal anchor of my commitment to the freedom of my people and the creation of my work. But I really also want to like leave it as an example here that for many oppressed peoples, the journey towards freedom is one that may not happen in their lifetime, but the imaginary can be that light in the darkness that can set fire to an entire generation's dreams that can that can become manifest. And that kind of level of thinking, that kind of ability to do time travel through speculative making, we actually need to draw upon those practices right now, given some of the generational level crises that we're dealing with, particularly when it comes to climate change. The reality is that we are entering a period of great volatility with the climate, and that in turn creates great volatility in terms of our political moments. And so there's a way that we must become nimble and accept volatility as the norm. And despite it becoming the norm, we can hold space for still what is possible in terms of our highest selves and our highest goals for the species. And that is, I think, the promise of so much speculative making and socially engaged artwork, particularly when it comes from this like larger moral purpose, given the challenges we have to deal with as a species. And so in many ways, I think that there's lots of opportunities to think about ways to examine process, product, and ourselves in the ways that we tell our stories and create our art. So some of the pieces that I'm going to share with you are going to reflect some of those questions from my own experience as an artist. And I'm really looking forward to kind of getting into it with you all, about the conversation as a whole once we get to Q&A. Now, a lot of the work that I do as the executive director and the creative director at Equality Labs. And we are a national Dalit civil rights organization. And for people who have never heard the term Dalit, Dalit is the word that was formerly used to, talk about people who were known as untouchable. And, if you guys know anything about that caste system, again, it was a pyramid where there was people at the top that exploited a bunch of people at the bottom. Those at the bottom were seen and called untouchable because we were seen as spiritually defiling. And no one gets to determine your position towards God. And so untouchables made short order and said, this is an epithet, we don't want that name. And so we call ourselves lots of different things. Sometimes people call themselves their caste name. Dalit is a political term, very much in the way that Black is a political term for folks that were formerly enslaved from the African continent. And we use that term in Equality Labs because it's we are in the pursuit of civil rights, and we use art and technology and digital security and technology advocacy to be able to help bring the stories and rights of our people as we fight against caste apartheid. And, what's so interesting is that in the work that we did, as an institution, particularly in like some of our first campaigns, one of the works that we really did a lot of intentional thinking about was around this issue of caste-based sexual violence. And, I was very lucky as an artist, and this, it was funny because this work is actually what gave birth to Equality Labs, is that I was very lucky to partner with the All India Dalit Rights Movement, which was the women's arm of the National Campaign for Dalit Human Rights in India. And they had this amazing campaign where they really wanted to bring Dalit women survivors together all across India to talk about the issues of structured caste-based sexual violence. And this was like a very big game changer because typically whenever you are looking about the issue of caste, it feels like an epidemic without a source, because there will be constant headlines of a Dalit woman who was raped here, Dalit people that were lynched over here, Dalit houses that were burnt here. And outside of the constant gaslighting of this being a structural and severe problem, the other issue that would come forward is that you would always know the caste of the person who was the victim, but you would never know the caste of the perpetrator. And you would never know the structural reasons why this was occurring. But all of these crimes are actually the way that caste apartheid lines are held together in India. And so, this campaign that, the leaders of AMAM wanted to do was a really incredible campaign. And it gave birth to one of the first Dalit hashtags called Dalit Women Fight. And really it was there to both kind of name how prevalent the violence was. So 2 out of 3 Dalit women are survivors of sexual violence. But also this hashtag was like really the coming out of the Dalit community on social media platforms. And, and it was a really remarkable thing that first hashtag was actually led by women. And as one of the artists who was in residence with those leaders, it was a really powerful thing to be able to train women who were advocating for themselves and leading one of the largest marches of survivors asking for accountability against this violence. And so, as a socially engaged artist, this was like one of my first large scale projects that I got to experiment, think about the challenges of telling the stories of a movement that's like, that's rolling out at the same time as you're covering it. But also, what are the challenges of when you're telling very sensitive stories of survivorship? And with this campaign, I remember, doing, over the course of it, like I did close to 40 interviews with survivors of sexual violence, some as young as 6 years old, some as old as like 65. And, what I think is so powerful is that, I wanted to do this work because I felt it was like the commitment to my people. And at the time, I was a Robert Rauschenberg socially engaged artist in residence. And, I think everybody wants to support you when you're telling a very powerful story. But I think the challenges is that most people think that support means visibilizing the issue. Very few people realize that when you're telling a story that involves violence and trauma, that part of your artist supports are that you need political support, particularly if you become a target of the state, which is what happened to me, but also psychosocial support, because there's no way that you can be in relationship with that content. And for both your subjects as well as yourself, there's an incredible amount of emotional grounding and processing that's required because of how raw this violence was. And that was actually like one of the most profound lessons I learned from this, is that you have to care for yourself when you're doing these stories right at the edge of violence, because we are drawn to it because of how important it is. But oftentimes artists do not put into their budgets self-care support and care support for their subjects, but it's a must in order to be able to delve in these topics. And one of the things I thought that was so interesting about Dalit Women Fight was like a lot of the thinking at that time was like, this is such a huge problem. When you search Dalit women online, you just get porn and other atrocity images. And so a big part of like my artist like mandate was to try to create powerful images of Dalit women being able to take up space and showing agency around this paralyzing problem, but also with dignity and beauty, and to take the stigma away of talking about sexual violence. Because I think, again, another big challenge, like in the Indian context compared to the American context, is that it's a little bit easier in the United States to be fighting for survivor rights and to also identify as a survivor. Whereas in India, very few women actually openly identify as a survivor because of how much shame there is related to it. So this was like a core thing that I had hoped to change, and I wanted to create platforms for dignity. And that really only comes from us being able to create those images of power, right? And moving from atrocity into power. So this was like a series of light signs that we did. And, some of the first light signs that were used like throughout South Asia. And, they were meant to be really guerrilla pieces of art. They're made out of very flexible, carryable material. They can be disassembled and packed up pretty easily, but they make an impact in the dark, particularly like when you're dealing with villages or when you're dealing with um, very kind of low-key rural environments. And so this experiment was really useful, and we kind of, innovated the practice here in the United States. And then later it was taken and used in different protests in India. And to see this kind of mobility was very powerful. And to later see this work in like the Brooklyn Museum was really remarkable, because you saw art that had traveled from like, classrooms to protests to survivors' homes into the museum. And I love that trajectory and that cycle that it went. The other thing that we did, part of this campaign on the US side, is we did large scale projection. So this is an image where we, projected this like message on the Brooklyn Bridge. We also did one like on the Indian Embassy. And the point of this was to actually break through the impunity. And, and I think that like, as we saw with like movements like Black Lives Matter, the issue is not that our people aren't telling our stories. The issue is really that the structural violence is preventing us from our stories being seen through a structural lens and with accountability. And so we tried many different tactics like this to raise the profile of Dalit women's issues, to also engage with an international audience, because again, the more that we brought this issue outside of India and connected with survivors movements and artists from around the world, the more protection survivors on the ground had, and the more that we could expose the issue of caste. And this was a very critical piece for us, I think, was we knew we had to break through the impunity. And so large scale projections and, other kind of creative interventions was really powerful for us to do that. The other thing that was also a really critical component of this project was a photo series. And, in the Dalit Women Fight campaign, they had this march called the Self-Respect March, where they went from state to state and would meet in districts with survivors from those districts. And some of those survivors would come to visit the next set of survivors in another district, culminating in a massive protest at the state capitol. And what was so compelling about that was that in each state you would go to in these like district gatherings, survivors would just come out of different villages and tell you their story. And their wounds were still raw, even 6 months to a year afterwards. And as someone documenting it, it was very profound to watch the level of violence towards my people. And I think part of it is that in the United States, when I would talk about this issue, people would just say, oh, you're making it up. This isn't real. If this was real, wouldn't it be on CNN? And, they did everything they could to gaslight me. And that was part of the engine of why I really wanted to be there, to sit and just listen without any opinion, what was happening. And once you were there and once you heard these stories, you couldn't look away. And this was one of the images that came out of the coverage of one of the pieces of it. And it really represents to me the light and the dark of this experience. And, the woman who's at the center of it on the right, she was a woman whose husband was murdered in front of her. And she herself was like beaten with iron rods and all sorts of other bad things that happened. And part of her was a little mad about what happened. Like she lost everything. She lost the person she loved. Her land was being threatened, and her only crime was they were a Dalit family who dared to own land, and dominant caste people wanted to take it away from her. So she was looking for justice. She was looking to be seen, and she just had this wail that you just could not get out of your mind because it was so profound. And I remember, as dark and bereft as she was, there was also these incredible Dalit women leaders who came right up to her and who comforted her. And that to me is also the other part of this story, is that however dark the experience has been as someone who is oppressed under caste, there's always someone in our community who carries a light of hope. And that's what these women are doing. They don't have they don't have much else to offer her, but they are witnessing her grief. They are giving her strength, and they're showing her the power of sisterhood and Dalit feminist power. And so to be able to capture that for me was like one of the biggest like honors of my life, because I feel like, this is whatever dignity that we've been removed, that's been, tried to be taken away from us through the caste system. I see so much dignity and grace here. And that's part of what I wanted to share, was these images of grace and power by our people. This is another image from that series. And what you're seeing here is survivors who are meeting with like the district collector. So you can think of them as kind of like a mix of the mayor of a district. And so this is the person that would hear, like when all these cases get brought to the police, this person is responsible for basically counting up the number of atrocity cases. And if there's a failure at the court level, this person is responsible for trying to create accountability. So this guy is basically saying that all these women who are bringing up these cases, they're all just there for the money. They're not really there to bring up issues because they believe in justice. They're doing it for the attention. They're doing it for any other reason outside of the fact that there could actually be a case. And that's why the women on the left are just looking at him like he's lost his damn mind, because he has, he's just like ridiculous. But I wanted to take an image of this because, again, when we're talking about most systems of oppression, we have lots of images of the consequences, of the bodies, of the violence, of the dispossession. We rarely have the same images of impunity. And to me, this image represents impunity. It represents the structural obstruction that so many Dalit people face. And that's really what I wanted to capture. And I think that I would also really encourage other folks that are thinking about, telling stories around oppression, is that we need to tell as much the story of the networks that benefit off of people's oppression, as we want to also tell the stories of the people who are being oppressed and the suffering there. And, I think that another piece that was also really profound to me around this work is that, especially early on, I really thought like, if we just tell the truth, like things are going to change, we just need the evidence. So I was very focused on creating data and evidence and images to show what's happening, right? But one of the things that, I started to get really, clued in on was that evidence doesn't really matter to the imaginary of the predators. And we all saw that, like with the impeachment hearing, right? How much more could we say who was responsible for galvanizing those people? But it was never really about the evidence, right? It's about power and it's about impunity. And so that really changes how you want to think about some of your strategies, because what you want to do sometimes is point to what the impunity is. Sometimes you may even want to tackle or push back against impunity. But if you only believe that just telling the truth will make a difference, you aren't understanding some of the power that goes into supporting disinformation and the facts that we have to often battle. And this was like very like important to me, because in one of the pieces of when we were filming, like our team was attacked by the police, and I was attacked by my equipment was broken. I was physically assaulted. Several of the survivors were also targeted. And I remember that after that experience, like I was so shook. I had a heavy level of PTSD. It was traumatizing to even hold the camera. And very few people, again, who were supporting the project and also supporting socially engaged artists knew what to do to help me, because it's just not something within the realm of fine arts to think about. And I think this is why I really want to encourage again, there's no way to tell and create art in volatile moments without yourself becoming a target. And so you need to budget for it. You need to create space around your own self-care, particularly because like sometimes you're not even doing I was like in the middle of rural, India, dealing with very difficult, violent actors. But, for many oppressed peoples, just your existence alone is trauma. And so I think that, to think about the ways that your arts practice might tap into that, give yourself space and nourish yourself, and know that you're going to need some foundation of care that's larger than yourself, that is structured and professional, so that you can really manage what comes out and comes next from that. So the other thing, in changing a little, changing categories a little bit, in kind of pushing the story, and thinking about different ways to tell the stories of survivors of sexual violence, another challenge that I think that, I came upon in my arts practice was that most of the images of Dalit women, particularly Dalit women who had been murdered or raped or what have you, were these like brutal images on WhatsApp. And, one of the consequences of being Dalit is that I have seen, the human body mangled in ways I've never expected, because our people will often share those images as ways to get justice or to raise attention. But it means that, these women and people who were all people who had like full lives and had dreams and discussions about where they wanted to go, get reduced to that final image of atrocity. And I wanted to see something more. I wanted to see if we could build something different. So these two were images of two Dalit women that were raped and murdered. One is this young girl, Delta, who was murdered and who was raped by her school teacher, principal, and out of despair, she, committed suicide, and her body was found in a well. And this other woman, Jisha, who was a nursing student and who was raped and murdered in her home. And, with all of the Dalit women who were working on these issues, women wanted to see dignity returned back to these women, and to see the promise of who they could have been fulfilled as part of a larger movement. So I created these images in collaboration with my friend Freedom, who is the artist behind this, the illustrations, and we worked on this concept together. And this really healed a lot of people to see these women portrayed in this way, because there is kind of like an attrition fatigue where it's like, if the only images you see of your people are atrocity, you don't think sometimes that you have a future. So sometimes drawing the future, sometimes drawing the possibility creates an opening in the heart that you just need, because things are just so hard and difficult to observe. Another project that we did also, and this was a really fun series to work on, is we did these series of posters called "Don't Be a Rapist." And it really came out of the dialogues that were happening around some of these sexual violence cases where, the Indian press was like putting on these like ridiculous things about all the ways that women could avoid being raped. And I just, and I remember this was like echoed in, a policy conversation I was in somewhere, and I just left it and I was so mad. And I was like, how about just starting with like not being a rapist? And, and so based on that, we came up with this slogan, and we have this poster both in like multiple languages as well as multiple Indian languages. And what was so interesting is people's response, because we have this as a t-shirt and we have this as a poster. But when you wear this t-shirt, there are a lot of people that get offended. And I remember this one person came up to me in the airport and they said, "Don't you think this is bad to have in front of children?" And I said, "I would assume that most parents would not want their children to experience sexual violence. So no, I don't understand." But it's like the aggressiveness of the gaze is okay if we talk about being survivors. But the minute we start to put the gaze and actually call into question those that are actually causing harm, that becomes destabilizing. And this shirt for me is like a really interesting litmus test, because you can tell by people's reactions to you how open they are to this conversation, and it really kind of creates a dynamic of confrontation where you see survivors are not willing to be quiet, and that frankly the problem really is as simple as stop raping, you know. And when you start to ask the questions as to why people do that, that's the deeper question we need to get into. Not women should wear rape whistles, or, you know, queer and trans folks should make sure not to be out late at night, or, you know, so on and so forth. Like all of these things that are about policing the bodies of survivors versus addressing, you know, what is broken in our cultures of consent. That this occurs is like, I think, a much more interesting conversation. And I think that, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I think that there is a part of my work that's also about yearning to create beyond the wake of oppression. And, you know, I always wonder, like, what if I wasn't born a Dalit, like, would I be, you know, what would be the kind of work that I would do? And I realized that, you know, I need to stop asking that question and just start to make that work, because that's the pieces that I'm really, you know, I'm also really interested in, you know. And I think it's important for those of us that come from, you know, backgrounds that are marginalized, for us not to accept the margins and to just choose the things that free us, whatever that looks like. And, you know, this was a piece of art that I think is something that I was really excited about, because it was, again, still using the photographic medium, but doing a lot of remixing to it. And it was a very, very healing series that I got to work on. And, you know, what this is that it's a copper plate, you know, and it's about, I would say, almost like 5.5 to 6 feet. And it came out of this process after I was attacked by the police. And again, I was so traumatized by the camera, I couldn't pick it up. I didn't know if I would ever shoot like another image again, because every time I picked it up, I would flash back to being attacked by the police, and that was really difficult. And I was, you know, in this residency, and, you know, one of the suggestions that I had come into thinking about was, could I start to play with the medium without touching the camera, that would then help me feel like I could come back to craft? And that's exactly what I did. And so I started by doing some research and thinking about, well, how early are the earliest images of Dalit women? And what I saw is that there was a whole bunch of colonial era photographs of caste oppressed women. And it's mostly caste oppressed women because those are the only people that would sit for foreign photographers, because of all of the prohibitions around purity and the protection of upper caste women. And you would see these very strange colonial photographs where women were posed. There's clearly not a lot of rapport between the photographer and the subject. And they would also try to apply like classical sculptural poses, so that they would try to pose women like they looked like they were in like Rome or in Greece. And it was very awkward. Like the intervention of the white gaze was not an addition here, right? But you know what, but it's the only artifact that we have of women from that time period. And so when I saw that, I wanted to liberate the women from those gazes. So that's why I kind of like cut them out of that image. But I also felt like there's another frame that always dominates, you know, women within the subcontinent, which is the rules of the kings that were informed by caste patriarchy. And so behind her is actually those laws. So this series basically juxtaposes Dalit women freed from like the colonial gaze, but also put in front of the laws that were written in copper plates that would deem them to be slaves, their land to be tilled by, dominant caste people, and basically puts them out of time in both of those contexts. And by putting it on a copper plate, it's like as a Dalit woman, I'm making my own law, my own practice of which, frees them both forward and backward in time. And, to me, this personal series was very healing because I was able to work with the photographic product. I was able to work on a medium that was tactile, and the touch actually really healed me to being able to pick up the camera again. And so I really want to encourage people that no matter what your, dominant medium of art practice is, to always have like another medium that you're not invested in like publicly, but where you can play and work out like issues and traumas that you might have in your more central medium, because having that center actually really allowed me to open up a whole other way that I would kind of work with Dalit women's images, but also deeply heal myself. And so it's like a real opportunity, I think, to always kind of diversify and practice to have that. Another place I think also that really found a lot of opportunity was, in thinking about some of the ways that my art practice also connects up to community-based research, is that, shortly after Dalit Women Fight, with some of those same leaders, like I helped to co-found a project called Dalit History Month. And Dalit History Month, was again fashioned after Black History Month, but it was a way for us to celebrate Dalits without violence. And, we had like one of our first Wikimedia editathons at MIT almost 4 years ago. And since then, it's become a global phenomenon with people celebrating this in countries all around the world. And every year we make art to kind of speak to the moment, speak to our people, and really document the power of where we're going. And so that's really been an incredible thing to kind of see how art gives space to this really potent form of community-based knowledge production. And now we'll be working on community, we're going into like our 6th year now, and we hopefully will, we'll be inviting you guys to some public events related to that. So the other challenge I think that has also been a big part of, any arts practice now is the ways that digital artists in particular are the targets of disinformation and harassment online. And unfortunately, Dalit women, particularly since we were some of the first Dalits who, were on these platforms, we were the canaries in the coal mine when it came to, explicit calls for violence and harassment. And I learned slurs I didn't even know existed for my people through this. And it was very, very traumatizing. So like from 2015 to now, I've probably received thousands of rape and death threats. Many of the curatorial bodies that like show my work or, carry my talks, like have to navigate sometimes with the violence of, difficult attempts to deplatform me. And it's very violent. Like, so here you'll see, I learned like XIAN is like a short form for Christian. So they're saying people who talk about Dalit issues are Christian colonists, and that we're anti-India, like they're talking about the UN Human Rights Commission. And by saying I'm a sepoy, they're saying I'm a betrayer to India for talking about these issues. And here there's like another slur here where they call me a rice bag convert, because rice bag is referring to Dalit converts to Christianity who received rice, rice supplies and grain supplies. And it's gross, and again, the thick skin that's required to tell your people's truth in the face of this violence is so hard. And, in the United States, we've seen so many, M4BL and BLM activists who have been targeted with, just as vicious and violent language. And I think this also takes a toll on our voice and our arts practice, is that it's hard enough as it is to be able to draw inspiration and create resonance and beauty and power for our people, but we have to do it at the time as these very vicious forces are trying to deplatform us. And unfortunately, a big part of my arts practice was educating curatorial bodies and stakeholders about, the violence that comes from being myself, and also to create safeguards, around that. And so this was a big part of the work that I did also within Equality Labs, is building digital security practices. Because again, like in 2015, we were targeted pretty heavily by, Hindu nationalists and bad actors. And they targeted one of my team members who they thought was immigration, insecure, and went after that person and told them if we didn't divulge the location of our safe house, that they would be deported. And that was deeply challenging for that person. And because they shared the location because they were scared. That was, of course you're going to do that. But at the time when this happened, we really struggled to get care and the mitigation of this that was trauma informed, and that also could really help us structurally address this from a lens that took both race and gender equity into mind. And so based on that, we created, the first kind of national digital security curriculum. And now we've become one of the largest national digital security providers in the United States, simply because, like, those of us communities who are the canaries in the coal mine, we were the harbinger of what's now become a normal part of discourse, which is like the routine deplatforming of leaders and organizers, unfortunately. So being able to also think about the problems that you face as an artist as structural problems also allows you to be someone who can support the conversation through a structural lens. And those are things that I really want to encourage people in terms of thinking about that, because sometimes I think when you're an artist, people assume that, oh, you'll be working on this arts project here, but society is over here. So the people who solve problems for society aren't necessarily also the same people in terms of art. And I want to really encourage people that actually one of the things that really has been functional and successful about our work at Equality Labs has been, we do not, just because we are artists, we don't limit our solutions to arts practice. The whole world is actually our target for change. And that really brings me to this like really interesting process that we dealt with like in 2018, where again, knowing that Dalit women were facing so many issues of gender-based violence and online harassment, we had someone who was one of our colleagues on the ground, basically be part of a meeting with Jack from Twitter to talk about the issues that women were facing in terms of gender-based violence. And what was unfortunate is that, in that meeting, our colleague gave them a poster that I was part of co-creating. And they took a picture, which was never supposed to be distributed, and then they leaked it online. So when it was leaked online, there was an entire crazy campaign called that happened in India Twitter, where basically people were trying to jail Jack. They said that he was offending, the poster that he's holding up says "Smash Brahminical Patriarchy," and essentially Brahminical patriarchy is the intersectional way that you would understand patriarchy through the lens of caste in the South Asian context. So just like how people say white hetero patriarchy here, people say Brahminical, hetero Brahminical patriarchy in India. So this led to like all of the authoritarians like melting down, wanting to try to find, Jack, trying to target me because I made the art. And it was just like a big chaos burger. And for the first time, the issues of caste like went global, because the difference when Dalit women are talking about Brahminical patriarchy is very different than when the CEO of Twitter holds it up. So that really started a whole journey. There was like a BBC cartoon, and this is like the BBC version of like what was going on when they were trying to show the chaos of it. This is the remix that authoritarians did of the poster and the things that we did. But it just goes to show like how a very, very simple poster, like, and again, I'll just go back to it. It's super fine very, very simple poster, but it had global ramifications simply because of the message and the way it was delivered. And I think that's also what I really want to also encourage people in terms of socially engaged arts practice, is that it doesn't need to be complicated, but it needs to get to the root of the violence and the problem, right? And so I think that, out of that experience, I ended up writing an op-ed about Twitter's caste problem. And what was really amazing about it was that this was one of the first op-eds written by a Dalit in the New York Times. And, it was really amazing to know that, like, as I wrote it, my bio said I was an artist and an activist, because again, I really want to encourage people that, like, artists have viewpoints about everything, but oftentimes, like, we don't see artists weighing in on the structural problems facing our people all the time. And as someone who is an artist and a researcher and a technologist, there was no one else that it could have written this op-ed the way that I did, because one, I was the artist whose art was used in this way, but also in terms of the technical problem, I'm one of the leading researchers looking at the problem of caste in tech. And so, again, we have the ability, there are no limits to where arts practice can go and where our lens of thinking as an artist can impact. And I think this is so important right now, because we are really imagining now for our very lives, and that the failure of so many dominator cultural systems to believe that the rest of the world, that even the world itself matters, is the problem. And, I think for many people, like, Biden winning was like a way that we could sigh a relief, right? Like for me, I felt like, oh God, I don't have to doom scroll every day CNN and see, are we gonna, what world shit show are we gonna have to deal with because the president tweeted X, Y, or Z, right? But while we have dodged that bullet and we're healing and we're having, difficult conversations, but we still have an optimistic way forward in the United States, we still have many countries in the world that are struggling under authoritarian regimes, whether it's Duarte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, or India and Modi. The largest democracies are in crisis right now, which means this really is going to be one of the defining challenges of this generation. So if you think about it being COVID, climate change, and authoritarianism, how we discuss and heal democracies and address the polarization that has come from social media platforms that have basically platformed the fringe into the center in terms of these far right conversations. This is a role I think artists are really uniquely engaged to deal with, because what is broken down is community. And community can only be healed by the building of new community. And art is one of the premier places to be able to build those connections of the heart that's for what's needed. And that in some ways, I think we also need to be thinking about the fact that we need vision in a time of reactionary tactics. And it's so hard because I think that, with so many crises, our nervous systems get real triggered to kind of only thinking in terms of reactionary processes, politics, and tactics. But we need to settle our nervous systems to be able to open up the possibility of the visionary, even in a time of chaos, because that's actually going to be the North Star that helps our people get out of these cycles of violence. And, as someone who does rapid response, both in terms of technology and creative work, one of the things I've always noticed is that the presumption of rapid response is that it always demands that we be in crisis, because it assumes that we cannot fundamentally change the foundations of society. So for artists that want to go beyond rapid response, I really recommend interrogating the foundational assumptions of your problem in any aspect of society that you're looking at, because that's really the nugget of what will help you open up the possibility for the seed of vision. And, and it can be hard, especially when your community is up against the wall and is deeply in crisis, to be able to find that opening. But I just want to encourage you, creating boundaries enough in your work practice where even 2 or 3 hours a week, even 1 hour, even 20 minutes dedicated to that vision work, it always pays off, because that's actually going to be the fertile ground for the future. because there's no future in rapid response, but there is future when we start to build the foundation of the society from that imaginary, even if it can't be made material yet. To be able to put those seeds in the imaginary means it'll come for the next generation. And again, like I've done tons of rapid response work. Like this was like one of the light signs that we did, like in terms of when Trump was first elected, and it was documented in like lots of different newspapers. But I have to say that being rooted in love is one of the biggest aspects of creating a visionary project. So anytime you feel like you're not able to access that, to connect you to the things that nourish you, to the things that you find love and possibility, those are the openings that are going to be able to help you get to that other side. I also wanted to share this one last project around work that we did around caste in the United States. And, again, this was a piece that had research components, but also artistic components to it. But, we conducted one of the first surveys documenting caste in the United States. And, the findings that we had out of this project were really intense. Like 1 out of 4 Dalits responded so that they faced physical assault. 1 in 3 reported being discriminated against during their education. 2 out of 3 said that they'd experienced workplace discrimination. And as a result of this, basically 50% of all Dalits we talked to said they would rather be in the closet. And this was significant because it was the first data set. And, at the time when we did this research, like we were just these 2 Dalit women, with like, some folks that helped us in terms of volunteers. I put the cost of the survey on a credit card, just to show like how big the hustle was to get this done. But once we had the data, everything changed. Like we had such a groundswell of support because it confirmed what Dalit communities had already known anecdotally. And it led to a congressional briefing. It led to a resolution in Congress supporting Dr. Ambedkar and Dalit History Month, which is now an official holiday that would be celebrated through Congress. But also what was so significant is that it led to structural policy change. So now there's like over 20 universities in the country working to add caste as a protected category to support caste equity on their campuses. We are seeing workplaces around the country who are now adding caste as a protected category. And very critically, the state of California sued Cisco for caste discrimination using our research. So the thing that was so interesting about this is that when we first did this work and created resonance for our community through data, the hardest part for us was that no one wanted to be photographed because everyone was afraid of being outed. So this is where the role of community-based arts work really kind of came forward. And so some ways that we solved it is that we did a podcast that had testimonies of people from both sides of the caste line, caste oppressed and caste privileged. And these were very intimate stories that most people have never heard. And so having this really helped in terms of being able to get stakeholders activated, but also just to talk about the taboo of caste, because it was so taboo in our community, people just weren't even talking about it. So this was really a great opening that podcasts helped us deal with because of the fear people had of being outed. We also had these like testimonies where we created illustrations and profiles. So people that shared with us images, stories, we actually turned into graphics, and there's close to, there's close to like 25 to 30 of these testimonies that we did. And this has been the heart of so much of our work, is that we have to use socially engaged art to depict our community because of the fear of violence. And so I think being able to empower people to work through aliases, to being able to be depicted through artistic measures, that really allowed our people to create platforms for themselves, even in the face of this violence. And so this was a powerful way that like art became a bridge for our voices at a time when people were still afraid of being outed. And then like some of the most recent series, and this is like, a series I think that kind of nicely ties us back into some of the work that I started with in terms of sexual violence, is that What I've seen is that the journey for accountability, especially when it comes to atrocity and violence, is not the same as healing. They can sometimes be linked, but actually the journey for accountability is often just as violent because the systems of justice are also rife with oppression. And so, this recent series that I started to do, and I did this series, in response to my friend Tani Ikeda's project, the Survivor Love Letter Project on Valentine's Day, was that actually, like, in starting to think about how you would write letters to Dalit survivors of violence, is that you have to take into account all of the ways that we're impacted by caste. So we have a series, and there'll probably be 20 illustrations when it's done, that comes out of the healing circles that we do, where Dalits are talking about issues of violence, the ways that structures of violence have impacted us. And it's all aspects of gender-based violence, like not just caste itself, but to be able to see beautiful images of people that are deeply reflecting and thinking about pain, but also power. This resonance and this image, these series, has like been one of the most viral and impactful of the work that we've done, simply because people are hungry for those depthful connections. So I think that's really a lot of the direction of the work that I'm going to be going in the next couple of years, is really trying to go deeper into those existential questions that violence brings up, but also looking at the tools of healing and trauma engagement that allows us to operate with non-attachment. And in many ways, I think that, again, I think the work that we do as socially engaged artists in volatile times is really about ensuring our people that we do have futures, for however you would determine that. And I think being able to create, anchors of beauty and anchors of power at a time when people feel so deeply insecure, I think that's one of our biggest mandates and our biggest responsibilities. And to be able to be in collective community practice to do that, I think that's one of the biggest gifts that we have. So with that, I'm going to actually start sharing my screen and bring in Sarah for our conversation, because I know that I'm really excited to be able to open up to Q&A and see our discussions.
And Maury, thank you so much. I mean, the profundity and the depth of your work and the understanding of the systems of oppression and your intervention is really incredible. And going head on into the violence while also dealing with the healing part of it, and the speculative is incredible. I think people love this talk. Thank you.
Of course.
We actually have run out of time. I'm going to take just one question, and then hopefully maybe send the questions to you and you can answer them at another time. But we'll just take one from Drew Baker, the very first question. What is the first thing you would advise a traditionally oppressed person, a Black woman, to do to tap into the possibility of freedom in art, personal appearance and presentation, entrepreneurship, etc., especially if they are frequently in predominantly white spaces?
So I think that's a beautiful question. And, I think that in my own journey, like what my experience was, is that journey was so hard because I didn't believe I could do it first. And so a lot of what I had to do was just basically kind of go to a quiet place and connect to ancestral power and think about all of those people that came before me that basically fought and lived and cried and hurt and just, I think of it kind of like a wave where people are just pushing and pushing and pushing until you got here, right? When you think about the profound foundation you have to be able to exist, to be loved, to share your truth, you are never really alone because you have all those people before you. And in that similar way, you are exactly where you are because there are many people relying on you to be your most manifest in order for your truth to be told. So seeing myself kind of like, forward and backward in time as both an ancestor and a descendant, that really helped me, And then it really also was about like a lot of self-love, because when you're like that lone person of color, particularly if you're like a Black woman in white spaces, or for me, like I'm a Dalit person in a lot of dominant caste spaces, people gaslight you and they don't even know it. They're like, well, are you sure it's really that bad? Or, this doesn't seem as interesting as X, right? Because there's a lot of things that are positioned as structural critique that really are about bias, in terms of like what you might be interested in. So in that case, like you sometimes may need to borrow theory from another place to inform your medium or practice if there isn't enough diversity of practitioners there. And also seeking mentors. Like the thing that really helped me when I was like an emerging artist was I had a lot of Black and Indigenous mentors that really took it upon them to mentor me, because they saw me as this like Dalit orphan who was like hungry and looking for someone to just help and give resonance. And oftentimes, most people who are elders or who are just a little bit further along, they may not have time for like a lunch, but they'll always have time for a coffee. And so, I think just being really ambitious about getting those coffees with people, for people who can support you, know your work, help shepherd you, that place is such a beautiful thing to ask for support and comfort for. And and I think that just being able to ask a question like you did is already showing how much power you're summoning to be able to do the work that you want to do. And there'll be lots of people that are going to come to that energy. And and you can always feel free to reach out. Like I definitely, because we didn't have enough time for Q&A, if there's any people here that want to further ask questions, like we can gather them and I'll make sure to have time to address it. Because again, it's important that we create collective communities of trust and care and vision, because again, it is our arts practice that are going to determine the pivot to what comes next. And what comes next must free us. It can't continue to enslave us.
Well, Thenmozhi, it's wonderful to end on those incredibly inspiring and words of wisdom. So thank you again. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. I think you can learn more at Equality Labs about Thenmozhi's work. And we hope to see you next week. Thank you.